You imagine yourself standing in the heart of a medieval village as the sun dips behind a line of low, timbered roofs. The light drains quickly, swallowed by the sky that turns from gold to gray to a velvety black. Day is over and night begins. For you, living in this world of the past, night is not a gentle companion. It is not the calm, reassuring quiet you may associate with evening today. It is something different entirely. It is danger, superstition, and vulnerability. To live in the Middle Ages is to learn that night is not merely the absence of light. Night is an entire landscape of fear. The first and most immediate reality that you would notice is darkness. And the word darkness in the medieval sense carries more weight than it does now. Today, you have lamps, electricity, streetlights glowing orange at intersections, and the quiet hum of technology that pushes the night back. But in the medieval world, when the sun set, it vanished fully. The village became a place of shadows, a silent theater where a single flame could make the difference between safety and a stumble that breaks an ankle. Darkness was total. No lamps burned down long streets. No cities glowed on the horizon. If you lived outside a castle or monastery, you would face blackness that felt endless. It was not uncommon to speak of the night as though it had a personality, a will of its own. Peasants prayed not just for their souls, but for their bodies, that they might reach morning unscathed. Think about the homes you would have known. Thatched cottages with a single small window, shutters closed against wind, rain, and wandering eyes. Inside, the only light source would be a candle or an oil lamp, costly to maintain, carefully rationed. Some households could not afford more than a stub of a candle each week. Firewood was precious, too. You might huddle with family near the hearth, the glow dim and smoky, and once the flames dwindled, nothing remained but shadows. To walk outside after dark meant to step into blindness. It meant to risk more than your eyes could manage. But lightlessness alone was not what made nights terrifying. Darkness invited other forces. It invited crime. Robbers and thieves used the cover of night to slip into houses or ambush travelers. A journey begun too late in the afternoon could turn fatal if the road had not been cleared by sundown. Stories spread of men disappearing on forest tracks, of wagons looted at crossroads, of lives cut short by unseen blades. In cities, where narrow lanes wound like mazes, shadows seemed to breed danger in every corner. There were night watchmen, of course, but their task was limited, their lanterns dim, their courage often faltering. The night belonged to those who exploited it. Then came the animals. Wolves still roamed much of Europe, and their howls pierced the night air. Packs could descend on livestock, leaving fields scattered with carcasses by morning. In the countryside, people feared foxes, wild dogs, or even boars, creatures with tusks sharp enough to maim. There were no fences strong enough to guarantee protection. Barn doors rattled in the wind, and every creak sounded like claws or teeth. For the farmer lying awake, listening to the night, each noise carried a question. Was it the wind, or was it something that would cost the family dearly by dawn? Yet physical threats were only part of the terror. The medieval imagination filled the night with spirits and demons, witches and wandering souls. To step outside was to enter a battlefield of unseen forces. You were taught from childhood that the devil worked hardest after sundown. Priests warned of demons that prowled in darkness, ready to seize the soul of the unguarded. Even educated men who could read and argue scripture, wrote of succubi and nocturnal spirits. In villages, whispers spread of witches riding on the wind, casting curses under moonlight. If a cow gave no milk, if a child fell sick, suspicion turned to the shadowy hours of the night when such enchantments were believed to take place. For ordinary people, sleep itself was a precarious act. Beds were narrow, often shared by entire families, sometimes even with guests or servants pressed into corners. Comfort was secondary to survival. Doors were barred, but locks were simple. The straw mattress itched, lice and fleas moved freely, and rats scurried across beams above your head. The night could be filled with scratching, squeaking, and the sound of animals nesting in the thatch. To drift into slumber required more than weariness. It required courage to let go of awareness when danger lurked so close. People prayed before lying down, whispering protection against sudden death. Death in sleep was common enough to inspire fear. Without doctors to diagnose strokes, seizures, or suffocation, the unexplained loss of breath was blamed on spirits, on witches, or on sins unconfessed. Imagine how it would feel to lie awake, aware of all these possibilities, every sense alert, listening to the uncertain noises beyond the door. A thud could mean a falling branch or a thief. A scream in the distance might be a fox or a soul in torment. And yet, despite these fears, life required you to endure the night, every single evening of your life. The rhythm of existence demanded it. People adapted, but adaptation did not erase dread. Rather, it gave birth to rituals, customs, and habits designed to fight back against the darkness. One such ritual was curfew. In many medieval towns, bells rang at dusk to announce that fires should be covered, doors closed, and streets emptied. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. It was both a safety measure to prevent flames from destroying timber houses and a reminder that night belonged indoors. To be caught outside after curfew was to invite suspicion, or worse, punishment. But imagine the psychology of hearing that bell. It was not just an instruction, it was a warning. Night was beginning, and with it, vulnerability. For some, the terror of night was compounded by occupation. Shepherds who kept watch over flocks had to remain outside, fighting drowsiness as they guarded against wolves. Messengers, forced to ride between towns, carried torches that sputtered and died, leaving them blind on lonely roads. Soldiers on watch at castle gates stood in silence, staring into darkness, unsure whether the next sound would signal an attack. Even within monasteries, where silence was a rule, monks rose in the deep of night to chant prayers, their voices echoing in stone halls lit by a single candle. Though it was worship, it was also a battle against despair, a way to claim that the night had not fully triumphed. As you sink deeper into this imagined world, you begin to see that medieval nights were terrifying not because of one single threat, but because of a convergence. Darkness, crime, beasts, superstition, and frailty of body. All these elements wove together to create an environment where fear thrived naturally. The night was a theater in which every human vulnerability was amplified. And yet, the people of the Middle Ages endured it, every single day of their lives, for centuries. You may wonder, if nights were so frightening, how did people cope emotionally? How did they make sense of the fear? The answer lies not only in faith but in storytelling. Families gathered around the hearth shared tales, often cautionary, sometimes humorous, designed to pass the long hours and keep minds sharp. Stories of saints who fought off demons, of heroes who braved forests, of tricksters who outwitted danger. These were not simply entertainments. They were tools of survival, helping people believe that fear could be mastered, even if only in words. But one has to ask, what happened when the story ended? The fire burned low, and silence returned. What did people feel then, in the raw moments when nothing stood between them and the dark? You would discover that fear of the medieval night did not exist in isolation. It shaped habits, laws, and even architecture. Darkness was expected every evening, so people built their lives around it. A candle stub could mean safety, and a bar across a door could decide survival. The night was not a surprise. It was a certainty, and yet people never stopped being uneasy when it came. What made it different from daylight was not just the absence of the sun, but the sudden shift of control. In the day, people governed streets, worked in fields, and decided their rhythms. At night, control slipped away. The forces of the unknown, animal, criminal, spiritual, took over. Communities had to decide how they would respond. The most obvious tool against the night was light itself. But light was expensive. A single candle might represent hours of labor, as beeswax required careful cultivation and tallow candles smelled unpleasant, giving off greasy smoke. Households rationed them tightly. A poor family might burn one candle only during meals and spend the remainder of the evening in near darkness. If someone needed to relieve themselves outdoors, they often relied on memory, groping blindly along familiar paths. In cities, wealthier quarters sometimes had lanterns strung across narrow lanes, but these were exceptions, not rules. Torches burned out quickly. Oil lamps sputtered. For most people, the medieval night remained almost entirely black. That is why the small glow of a candle became so symbolically powerful, representing safety, presence, and even divine favor. To imagine a flame going out suddenly was to imagine exposure to everything the darkness held. Communities attempted to impose order with watchmen, whose role was both practical and symbolic. They carried lanterns and called out the hours, assuring residents that someone remained awake while others slept. But their effectiveness was questionable. Many watchmen were elderly or infirm, unable to fight off attackers. Some were corrupt, accepting bribes to look the other way. In many towns, citizens rotated the duty, which meant that few were trained or motivated to handle serious threats. Nevertheless, their presence was vital, because what people feared most was not just danger itself, but the feeling of being abandoned to it. A voice, crying the hour, no matter how weary, was a reminder that someone else was awake, watching the same shadows. Church bells also shaped the night. When curfew rang, households hurried to cover fires, lest flames spread unchecked. Fires were perhaps the most feared nighttime catastrophe in towns and villages, where timber houses pressed close together. One tipped candle could destroy entire streets. People slept lightly, listening for the crackle of flames, ready to rouse neighbors with shouts. Fear of fire was so pervasive that many ordinances strictly banned open flames after sunset. And yet, candles were needed. The contradiction made every act dangerous. To carry a candle upstairs was to risk setting straw alight. To leave a fire burning for warmth was to gamble with one's home. People lived in this tension, unable to banish fire but never safe from it. The medieval night also enforced social divisions. Wealth determined whether you could afford protective shutters, an extra servant to watch the door, or oil for lamps. Nobles in castles had guards and thick walls, which did not erase fear but diminished some threats. Peasants had only dogs, barred doors, and hope. The poor were more vulnerable to thieves, more likely to be accused of witchcraft if calamity struck, and more exposed to animals and weather. This inequality shaped the way people spoke of night. For the wealthy, it was inconvenient and unsettling. For the poor, it was an active predator, one that tested every resource they had. Animals played a larger role than modern minds might expect. People lived side by side with livestock, often sharing the same structure. A cow in distress at night could mean hours of labor by torchlight. A horse that spooked could trample its stall or break free. Night was filled with animal noises that today would seem shocking in volume and frequency. Dogs barked, roosters crowed at false dawns, owls screeched from rafters. Every sound had to be interpreted. Was that bark a response to a fox or a sign of a thief? Was that thud the fall of a branch or the arrival of strangers? The night was a conversation in code, and survival depended on listening closely. Yet, beyond the practical dangers, there was the imaginative weight of night. Dreams carried immense significance in medieval culture, often interpreted as messages from God or omens from evil spirits. To sleep was to open oneself not just to rest but to visions, some terrifying, others hopeful. Nightmares were believed to be the work of demons pressing upon the chest, stealing breath, and planting sinful thoughts. The Old English word for such an experience, mare, eventually gave rise to the word nightmare itself. Families might hang religious charms or recite protective prayers to guard against these nocturnal assaults. The fact that people interpreted dreams as external forces rather than internal psychology shows how vulnerable they felt. Even their minds were not safe once darkness fell. Travel at night was almost unthinkable unless absolutely necessary. Roads were unlit, forests crowded close, and bridges were narrow and treacherous. Inns existed, but many closed their doors early to avoid the risks of harboring strangers after sundown. Bandits lurked in the very same forests that travelers had to cross. Some bridges collected tolls, and being caught after hours without payment could lead to imprisonment. Thus, to travel by night was not simply inconvenient, it was considered foolhardy. Those who attempted it were viewed with suspicion, as if only criminals or desperate souls would choose such a path. The rhythm of life enforced by nightfall was absolute. Most people stayed where they were or risked paying dearly. This rhythm also influenced agriculture. Farmers depended on daylight to measure labor, and at night, work largely ceased. Yet certain tasks could not wait. A sick animal, a calving cow, or a sudden storm demanded action, no matter the hour. In these moments, a lantern was hoisted, the family stumbled into the dark, and the vulnerability of the night became clear again. Imagine a boy carrying a pail of water across a frozen yard, the torchlight flickering, his breath visible in the air. Each step was uncertain, each shadow a threat. He was not thinking of grand history or politics. He was thinking of whether he would make it back without injury. These tiny acts of survival defined medieval nights more than battles or kings ever could. Another element that made night so terrifying was silence. Daytime was noisy. Markets shouted, hammers rang, animals brayed, children cried. Night stripped all that away. Villages fell quiet, broken only by occasional sounds. Silence itself was unsettling, because it meant you could hear things you might not wish to hear. Creaks, distant footsteps, the shuffle of someone moving outside your door. Human imagination filled the gaps, often with terrifying possibilities. Silence became the breeding ground of superstition. It was in silence that witches were thought to chant spells, that demons were believed to prowl, that ghosts were said to wander seeking vengeance. Religious life sought to reclaim the night. Monastic communities structured their routines to include prayers in the middle of the night, known as the night office or matins. The idea was not only devotion, but defiance. To pray while the world slept was to challenge the power of darkness, to remind monks that God's light shone even in blackest hours. For lay people, the church also offered midnight masses during special festivals, drawing communities into sacred spaces where candles flickered and chants rose. These occasions transformed the night from terror into reverence, but only temporarily. When the bells ceased and people returned to their cottages, the ordinary dread resumed. Consider, too, the weather. In winter, night fell early and lasted long. Darkness could stretch from late afternoon to late morning, imposing endless hours of vulnerability. Snow muffled sound making silence deeper. Cold turned fires into lifelines. In summer, nights were shorter but could bring violent storms, thunder echoing across wooden beams, lightning threatening barns. Without modern forecasting, people interpreted storms as divine warnings or signs of evil loose in the world. The uncertainty only magnified their sense that night was not safe. One might think that people grew used to such conditions, but fear was not erased by repetition. Instead, it was woven into the culture, reflected in proverbs, songs, and even architecture. Windows were small not only to conserve heat, but to keep out evil spirits. Doorways were blessed with holy water. Crosses were etched onto barns to guard livestock. Every detail testified to the struggle of surviving darkness. Night was not simply endured. It was fought against with every tool available, material or spiritual. And yet, despite these precautions, the question lingers. How many nights ended not in rest, but in tragedy? How many families woke to find livestock gone, fires lit, or loved ones dead? For every ritual of protection, there were failures. For every candle that burned, many guttered out. If you had lived then, would you have trusted your prayers to keep you safe? Or would you have feared, deep down, that the night always claimed what it wished to claim? When darkness settled over medieval villages and towns, it did not simply transform the landscape. It transformed society itself. You would have felt the difference not just in your own body, but in the rules that governed your neighbors. Day and night were two different realms, and they demanded two different sets of behaviors. Night was not lawless, but it was a place where the normal balance of authority shifted. It was here that superstition flourished. Rules bent, and fear often dictated more than reason. The law of curfew dominated urban life. When church bells tolled, citizens were expected to retire to their homes. Fires were to be extinguished or tightly controlled, shutters fastened, doors barred. To be caught outside after curfew invited suspicion. Perhaps you were a thief, perhaps a spy, or perhaps something worse. This suspicion turned the night into a constant theater of imagined crime. In some towns, even carrying a weapon after dark was a punishable offense. But ironically, those who ventured out without a weapon risked their lives to bandits. The result was a paradox. Law encouraged disarmament, but fear encouraged self-protection. Every decision you made under the cover of night was weighted with danger. The church also played an immense role in shaping attitudes toward night. Priests warned against activities after sundown, arguing that darkness emboldened sin. Drinking, gambling, and illicit meetings were associated with the hours when honest folk were supposed to sleep. To disobey this cultural rhythm was to invite moral as well as physical peril. Many believed that demons were more active at night, prowling in search of weakened souls. For this reason, prayers before bed became ritualized and fervent. It was not merely about thanking God for the day, but begging Him for protection against the unseen. To sleep without prayer was considered reckless. Faith, in many ways, became the only lantern against the overwhelming dark. Superstition, however, filled in where faith left questions unanswered. You would have heard countless warnings about spirits haunting crossroads or witches gathering in forests under the moon. These tales were not simply stories for children. They were explanations for misfortune. If your livestock sickened after a moonless night, it was tempting to believe witches had passed by. If you heard knocking at your door at midnight, some believed it was not a neighbor, but death itself. To live in a medieval community was to interpret ordinary events through a lens of cosmic struggle. Night gave superstition its strongest stage, because so little could be seen or verified. Shadows became evidence. silence became proof. The legal system itself responded to these fears. Watchmen patrolled, but their cries of "all is well" were sometimes doubted. Communities passed ordinances forbidding strangers to remain overnight unless vouched for by locals. Inns were required to keep strict guest lists, since criminals could easily vanish into the blackness. Punishments for nighttime crimes were often harsher than those committed in daylight, precisely because they were viewed as violations against the natural order. To commit theft at night was not merely to steal, it was to disrupt the fragile peace upon which all rested. You can see how fear did not just affect individuals, but shaped an entire philosophy of justice. Meanwhile, families adapted their behavior to mitigate risks. Beds were shared, not only for warmth but for reassurance. The presence of another body meant you were not alone in facing the noises of the night. Even the design of houses reflected these concerns. Doors were reinforced, windows were shuttered, and sleeping chambers were kept small and enclosed. In many rural communities, livestock were housed close to humans, creating both warmth and a crude form of security. But the effect was that the sounds and smells of animals became part of your nightly experience, mingling with the silence and fear. The medieval night was never a purely private affair. It was shared with family, animals, neighbors, and unseen forces. The fear of crime remained constant. Thieves understood that shadows were allies. They knew households rationed candles, leaving long stretches of darkness inside. Even those who bolted doors were not always safe, as wood was easily pried or burned. Highwaymen stalked travelers, knowing they were at their most vulnerable without light or numbers. It is important to remember that medieval economies were fragile. Losing a horse, a few coins, or a tool could mean disaster for an entire family. This made theft far more devastating than modern minds might imagine. A single act of nighttime crime could undo years of effort, which magnified the anxiety that darkness created. One of the most unnerving realities was how little could be verified. You might hear a rustle outside, but was it the wind, a fox, or a thief? You might see a shape in the corner, but was it a cloak hanging from a peg, or a stranger standing still? Human imagination filled in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. That is why tales of demons pressing on sleepers' chests or witches riding the night air became so widely believed. They were ways of explaining the constant sense of oppression people felt after sundown. Without lanterns bright enough, without knowledge deep enough, the unknown became the most powerful enemy. At the same time, communities found ways to reclaim the night. Night festivals, feasts, and church vigils punctuated the calendar, moments when the entire community confronted the darkness together. Candles were lit in great numbers, music was played, and collective faith temporarily beat back fear. These occasions showed that people did not merely submit to night, they resisted it, if only briefly. But the fact that these events felt so extraordinary demonstrates how unnatural it was considered to remain awake after hours. Ordinary nights remained oppressive, and these festivals only underlined how rare true comfort was. The deeper question, one that every medieval person must have asked at some point, was whether darkness itself was cursed. Why would God create a world where half of life was spent in such terror? Was night a punishment, a reminder of human fragility, or simply an inevitable balance to daylight? These theological questions were not academic. They influenced daily choices. If night was seen as cursed, then extra precautions were justified. If night was simply neutral, then perhaps people overreacted. But the overwhelming consensus in proverbs, sermons, and customs leaned toward suspicion. Darkness was not to be trusted, and trust was the one thing survival depended upon. So, as you lay in bed in a medieval cottage, you would not simply be resting. You would be listening, interpreting, praying. Every creak of timber could be a thief. Every sigh of wind could be a spirit. The legal system, the church, the family bed, even superstition itself, all were tools to keep terror at bay. But they could never banish it completely, because underneath all the rituals and protections, the essential question remained unresolved. Was the medieval night a natural danger, or was it a supernatural enemy bent on claiming what humans valued most? When we think of danger in the medieval night, our minds often turn to criminals or spirits. Yet, in truth, many of the greatest threats came not from fellow humans or imagined demons, but from the natural world itself. Night was the hour when fire could turn from a source of comfort into an instrument of catastrophe. When pests spread silently through food stores, when cold reached its sharpest, and when even the animals outside tested the fragile boundaries of human settlement. The medieval night was not simply about fear of the unknown. It was about living with very real dangers that daylight only partly revealed. Fire posed perhaps the most immediate risk. In homes built largely of timber, with thatched roofs and open hearths, the chance of a blaze was ever present. At night, when families slept, the smallest spark could leap into a disaster that consumed not only one house but entire neighborhoods. For this reason, curfews were not only legal restrictions but practical safeguards. Bells signaled the time when fires should be covered with ash, damped down, or entirely extinguished. The French word couvre-feu, cover fire, eventually gave rise to the English curfew. Imagine lying down at night, aware that a poorly tended flame in your neighbor's cottage might reduce your entire livelihood to ashes by morning. Fear of fire was not abstract. It was woven into the nightly routine of smothering embers and double-checking hearths. Disease also found opportunity in the dark. Night was when vermin stirred most freely. Rats crept through food stores, spreading fleas and contaminating grain. Lice and bedbugs emerged as families huddled together in crowded sleeping quarters. These pests did not just cause discomfort. They were carriers of plague, typhus, and other diseases that devastated medieval populations. With no modern sanitation, the night became the time when these invisible enemies flourished. To wake scratching was not unusual. To wake feverish was a warning sign. The connection between night, vermin, and illness reinforced the sense that the dark hours were hostile to human survival. Cold added another layer of danger. Before central heating, warmth was a fragile commodity. Fires went out, blankets were limited, and bodies cooled as the night wore on. Hypothermia was a real risk, especially for infants, the elderly, or the sick. In some regions, communal sleeping arrangements were essential not only for security but for survival against the cold. Livestock were brought indoors, not simply for protection against thieves, but to add body heat to otherwise frigid rooms. Yet this, too, carried risks. Disease could pass between animals and humans, and the air itself could become heavy with smoke and waste. Every solution seemed to open another door to discomfort or danger. Night offered no perfect refuge. Animals beyond the household posed yet another threat. Wolves prowled in forests, and though they rarely attacked humans directly, they threatened livestock, which meant survival itself. Bears still roamed parts of Europe, and even stray dogs could pose a menace in packs. The howling of wolves at night was not the distant, almost romantic sound we imagine today. It was a chilling reminder that nature pressed close to human settlements, ready to take advantage of any weakness. Farmers who heard their animals agitated at night had reason to fear. A predator could undo months of labor in a single raid. Protecting herds and flocks was a nightly concern, one more source of anxiety in the long, dark hours. Environmental hazards also played their role. Roads were treacherous in darkness, filled with mud, ruts, and sudden drops. Rivers and wells, so vital by day, became deadly traps by night, when a misstep could mean drowning. Even within homes, dangers abounded. Stairs without railings, thresholds with uneven stones, sharp tools left too near the sleeping area, all became hazards when families stirred in the dark. With candles rationed and expensive, most households chose to move in darkness rather than waste precious light. Accidents were inevitable, and injuries that might be survivable today often proved fatal in a world without advanced medicine. To rise in the night for even a simple need carried with it the possibility of disaster. Noise also took on a strange life after sundown. Without the constant hum of modern cities, medieval nights were filled with sharp, distinct sounds. The bark of dogs, the cry of owls, the sudden creak of wood. Each noise could be a warning, or it could be nothing. But in a society so attuned to survival, few sounds were dismissed casually. Families learned to interpret the difference between a restless sheep and a wolf on the prowl, between the whistle of wind and the scrape of a thief's footstep. Night was an education in listening, in waiting, in fearing what could not be seen. Silence was not always comfort. Sometimes it was worse, a void filled by imagination. The psychological weight of these physical dangers cannot be overstated. When so many threats pressed in from every side, fire, disease, cold, predators, accidents, the night became a crucible of endurance. To survive, it was to earn another day. And so rituals grew up around this endurance. Families developed habits of prayer, charms against evil, careful household checks, and shared beds not only to manage fear, but to maximize their odds of waking alive. Night was not merely endured, it was actively battled, with every precaution that limited resources could allow. Yet, despite all these efforts, tragedy was never far away. Records from medieval towns tell of whole families perishing in house fires started by an overturned lamp. Chronicles describe wolves snatching children from villages, their cries echoing into silence. Illness spread through cramped quarters at terrifying speed, striking hardest in the cold of night. These were not isolated fears but lived realities. To hear of such an event in the next village was to feel confirmed in your own nightly anxieties. Fear was not simply cultural. It was continually justified by evidence. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that medieval people could never fully control the night. Daylight allowed work, planning, and progress. But night always reset the balance, reminding humans of their limits. No matter how carefully fires were managed, how tightly doors were barred, how fervently prayers were spoken, danger remained. This vulnerability may be the essence of why the medieval night felt terrifying. It was not only the darkness itself, but the knowledge that human effort could not fully master it. And so, lying in your bed, you would feel all these dangers pressing close. The embers of the hearth fading, the scratching of vermin, the cold seeping into your bones, the distant howls of animals, the creak of timber overhead. It was all a reminder that survival was uncertain. Tomorrow might bring light and labor, but tonight you existed in a suspended state, watching, waiting, and hoping. Which of these dangers, fire, disease, cold, beasts, or simple bad luck, would breach your defenses first? If the physical dangers of the night were daunting, the psychological burdens were perhaps even heavier. The medieval world was one in which faith, superstition, and folklore intertwined to shape how people understood the dark hours. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the world was not only more dangerous but more permeable. Boundaries between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, the sacred and the profane, seemed to thin. Night was not simply an absence of light. It was a landscape filled with presences that humans could neither fully explain nor control. Religion set the framework for much of this fear. Medieval Christianity painted the night as a time when evil forces prowled more freely. The devil himself was thought to be especially active after dark, tempting the weak, whispering in dreams, or stirring unrest in animals and humans alike. Demons were not abstract ideas. They were believed to be tangible, dangerous beings who could attack the soul or body. Prayers before sleep were not mere rituals of piety. They were shields against unseen enemies. To forget them was to risk vulnerability. You might drift into dreams, but your soul was understood to remain in perilous proximity to forces waiting to seize it. Ghosts also haunted the medieval imagination. Stories of restless souls wandering churchyards, fields, or lonely roads filled the oral culture of villages. Some were said to be the spirits of the unburied or improperly buried. Others were sinners condemned to walk until judgment. The night was their domain. To encounter one was a grave threat not only to your peace of mind but to your spiritual well-being. People told tales of travelers who vanished after meeting such figures, of whispers in the dark that belonged to no living voice. These stories reinforce the belief that after sunset, the world was shared uneasily between the living and the dead. Witches, too, became a focus of fear. Although the great witch hunts would peak later in early modern Europe, the Middle Ages already carried a suspicion of individuals who were thought to harness the powers of darkness. At night, it was said, witches gathered in secret places, forming pacts with demons, flying to meetings or casting spells that harmed crops, animals, and neighbors. A sick child, a spoiled batch of beer, or a sudden storm might all be blamed on nocturnal witchcraft. The night gave cover to these suspicions, and each unexplained sound could be interpreted as proof that dangerous rites were taking place just out of sight. Animals, too, were implicated in the supernatural atmosphere. Cats, especially black ones, were often linked to witchcraft. Owls were thought to be omens of death. Dogs howling at night were believed to sense spirits or even herald the approach of death itself. The natural behaviors of these animals fed into the medieval conviction that the night revealed hidden connections between the physical world and invisible powers. To hear an owl cry outside your window was not merely unpleasant. It was a warning that fate had turned its gaze upon your household. Dreams provided another arena where the supernatural touched daily life. The medieval mind viewed dreams not as random products of the sleeping brain, but as messages, temptations, or warnings. A dream could come from God, guiding you toward virtue, or from demons, luring you into sin. The vulnerability of sleep made dreams both fascinating and terrifying. What you experienced in them might shape how others judged your moral state. To confess a troubling dream could be seen as an admission of weakness or even complicity with evil. Thus, even within the safety of your bed, night could bring assaults that daylight could not prevent. The very sounds of the night carried cultural weight. Bells from monasteries punctuated the darkness, calling monks to prayer at hours when the rest of the world struggled to sleep. To hear these bells was to be reminded that the night belonged not only to spirits but to God's servants who battled them with chants and psalms. Villagers, lying awake in the dark, knew that unseen battles of prayer and evil took place as they waited for morning. Every toll, every chant, every hymn that drifted faintly across the fields became part of the nightly drama of salvation and damnation. Rituals developed to cope with this anxiety. Families placed protective symbols above doors or near beds. Holy water might be sprinkled around the home. Charms made of herbs or inscribed prayers were kept under pillows. Candles were lit not only for light but for protection. The Church played a central role in reinforcing these practices, teaching that faith and ritual were the only defenses against the dark. Yet at the same time, folklore carried its own remedies: iron nails to ward off spirits, salt to keep away witches, or certain rhymes whispered before sleep. These layered practices reveal how deeply fear of the night permeated medieval life. Communal fear also shaped behavior. To walk alone at night was a mark of suspicion. Why would anyone risk such dangers unless they were up to no good? The very act of venturing into darkness became a statement that invited scrutiny. Suspicion of strangers was heightened after sunset, and communities often judged character based on how one behaved during the night. To be seen walking at odd hours could bring accusations of theft, sorcery, or worse. Thus, the night not only threatened individuals with danger, but carried the power to unravel reputations. Literature and art of the period testify to these anxieties. Illuminated manuscripts depict grotesque demons crowding around sleeping figures. Church sermons thundered about the perils of night, reminding the faithful that death and judgment could arrive before dawn. Popular ballads and folk tales dwelled on nocturnal encounters with spirits or monsters. These cultural expressions did not simply reflect fear. They magnified it, embedding it deeply into the consciousness of each new generation. Night became a stage upon which the eternal conflict between good and evil was reenacted daily. What is striking is how total this vision of night was. Unlike modern fears, which may be compartmentalized or rationalized, medieval fears of the night encompassed every level of existence: physical, spiritual, communal, and psychological. The night was a field where human weakness was most evident, and where external threats, natural or supernatural, were most powerful. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind, every stirring of animals was interpreted through a lens of cosmic struggle. To live through the night was not only to endure danger, but to reaffirm one's place in a world ruled by forces beyond comprehension. And so, as the medieval person lay in bed, staring into the dark, the mind would not rest. Were those footsteps outside truly your neighbor, or something else? Was that dream a harmless fancy, or a warning of sin? Did the howl of the dog signal a passing thief, or the approach of death? These questions gnawed at the edge of consciousness, keeping sleep shallow and uneasy. Morning light offered relief, but the memories of the night lingered, reinforcing the cycle of fear. The psychological burden of night was therefore profound. It shaped how communities organized their lives, how families raised their children, how churches structured their rituals, and how laws were enforced. To fear the night was to participate in a shared reality, one that bridged heaven and earth, life and death, natural and supernatural. And it was a fear that could never be fully escaped, for the night always returned. The question was never if it would come, but what it would bring. And so, we must ask, in a world where every shadow could conceal a spirit, every dream could harbor temptation, and every sound could be an omen, how did people manage to close their eyes at all? If the medieval night was terrifying to the individual, it was equally daunting to entire communities. Villages, towns, and cities faced the collective challenge of surviving hours when visibility was gone. Strangers prowled more easily, and unseen forces, both human and spiritual, seemed to multiply. The night tested not only personal courage but also the structures of society. How communities responded to the darkness reveals the extent to which fear of the night was woven into the fabric of medieval life. One of the most common responses was the institution of curfews. The word itself comes from the Old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. At sunset or shortly after, bells would toll from churches or civic towers, signaling that it was time to extinguish household flames and prepare for rest. The practical purpose was fire prevention, since open flames posed a constant hazard in timber-built towns. Yet the psychological effect was deeper. The curfew bell marked the transformation of the town into a different place, one closed off from normal activity and surrendered to the uncertainties of the night. To hear its sound was to be reminded that you were expected to be indoors, that the world outside had become less safe, and that watchmen and patrols would be keeping order in your absence. Watchmen themselves became symbolic figures of nocturnal authority. Their duty was to patrol streets, guard gates, and sound alarms if trouble arose. They carried lanterns, staffs, or sometimes weapons, but their greatest tools were their voices, calling out the hours, warning of fires, or alerting neighbors to suspicious activity. They were both protectors and reminders of the dangers lurking in the dark. Their chants or cries broke the silence of the night, a rhythm of reassurance mixed with unease. To hear a watchman's voice was to know someone was awake and vigilant. But it was also to be reminded that danger was expected. Otherwise, his presence would not be required. City gates embodied another communal response to night's threats. In walled towns, gates were often locked after dusk, sealing the community against outsiders. This act physically transformed the town into a kind of fortress. Travelers arriving late were forced to camp outside, their safety uncertain, while those inside were trapped within. The locked gate was both security and prison, protecting residents but isolating them at the same time. The practice reveals how starkly medieval societies divided day and night. By day, the world was open; by night, it was closed. The boundary between the two was not just temporal but physical, marked by the heavy thud of closing gates. Churches and monasteries also played a key role in shaping the communal rhythm of night. Bells rang not only for curfew but for nocturnal prayers. Monks rose at intervals through the night to chant the divine office, their voices echoing across sleeping towns. These rituals reminded communities that spiritual guardianship was continuous, that even while others slept, prayers were being offered against the darkness. Villagers who stirred at night might hear faint chanting carried on the wind, a sound that mixed comfort with solemnity. The knowledge that holy men were awake, engaged in battle with unseen forces through prayer, gave shape to the idea that the night was contested ground between good and evil. Markets and fairs also adjusted to the perils of night. Transactions were rarely conducted after sunset, and laws often forbade the sale of goods in darkness to prevent fraud. To buy or sell at night was considered risky, both for safety and honesty. Communities enforced these rules strictly, understanding that disorder thrived in shadows. Inns and taverns became crucial spaces, offering shelter to travelers caught outside after dark. Yet even these places were ambiguous, for the same walls that provided refuge could also hide danger. Brawls, thefts, and illicit dealings were common. The medieval night was never neutral. It amplified both hospitality and hostility. Festivals and rituals, too, reflected communal efforts to master the night. Certain feasts deliberately inverted its terrors, turning darkness into celebration. Night vigils for saints, midsummer bonfires, and Christmas Eve gatherings lit the dark with fire, song, and community presence. These events temporarily reshaped the meaning of night, transforming it from a time of fear into one of festivity. Yet the very need for such rituals suggests the depth of anxiety they sought to counteract. People gathered in groups not only to celebrate but to shield themselves from isolation. A crowd, a fire, a song, these became bulwarks against the invisible threats that otherwise haunted the hours before dawn. Law enforcement also recognized the particular risks of night. Medieval courts often treated crimes committed after sunset with greater severity, since they were seen as more dangerous and premeditated. To be caught stealing at night carried harsher penalties than the same act by day. The law mirrored popular perception. To operate under cover of darkness was to align oneself with forces of chaos. Communities internalized this view, equating night wandering with guilt. Suspicion was easily cast on those who defied curfews, and reputations could be ruined by nocturnal activity. To be outside at the wrong time was to risk becoming part of the night's dangers in the eyes of others. Lighting also became a communal concern. Streets were largely unlit, but in some wealthier towns, authorities experimented with oil lamps or lanterns in key areas. The cost was borne collectively, either through taxes or neighborhood contributions. Each lamp symbolized not only illumination but solidarity, a shared acknowledgement that darkness was a problem too large for individuals to solve alone. Even so, most medieval streets remained shrouded, and the pools of light that did exist were like islands in a sea of shadows. People instinctively stayed close to them, drawing comfort from their glow while knowing that beyond them lay an unknown expanse. The military dimension of night cannot be overlooked either. Armies feared and respected darkness, often avoiding battles after sunset. Yet night raids and ambushes were possible, and communities dreaded them. Villages near contested borders knew that enemies might strike under cover of dark, setting fires or seizing goods. To guard against such threats, night watches were doubled, and bells were ready to sound alarms. Even in peacetime, the memory of raids lingered, reinforcing the association of night with vulnerability. Communities lived with the awareness that security was fragile and that the dark could always conceal an approaching foe. Communal fears even shaped architecture. Houses were built with shutters to close tightly at night. Streets were designed with gates or barriers that could be locked. Windows faced inward toward courtyards, emphasizing protection. The built environment became a daily defense against the terrors of darkness. Every bar, bolt, and heavy door was not only a physical measure but also a psychological comfort, reassuring residents that their households stood against the night. Communities learned to live within these fortified rhythms, their very structures shaped by fear of what lurked outside. The role of sound in communal nightlife is striking. Bells, watchmen's cries, dogs barking, and roosters crowing all formed a kind of nocturnal symphony. These sounds carried information, reassurance, or warning. Silence, by contrast, was unsettling, a signal that something might be wrong. The community listened collectively, interpreting each noise as part of the ongoing struggle to survive the night. To live in a medieval town was to be immersed in a shared soundscape where every note had meaning, especially after dusk. What emerges from all these practices is the sense that the medieval night was never simply endured individually. It was managed, resisted, and interpreted collectively. Communities built rhythms, laws, rituals, and structures that turned the overwhelming terror of darkness into something at least partially navigable. Yet none of these measures eliminated fear. They only reshaped it, making it manageable but never absent. Night always remained a frontier of uncertainty, a reminder of human limits before forces greater than themselves. And so, as the curfew bell tolled, as gates clanged shut, as watchmen called out the hour, medieval communities settled uneasily into their nightly truce with darkness. They had done all they could, and still the night would come. What else could they do but endure it together and wait for dawn? Stories, suspicions, and symbols. To step into darkness was to step into a world shaped as much by imagination as by reality. For most people, the unseen was never neutral. It was alive with forces waiting. The medieval night was not only a physical challenge but also a psychological landscape, thick with to act upon them, forces that laws, gates, and watchmen could not contain. Fear of the night was rooted in a cultural framework that explained every shadow and silence as meaningful, often ominously so. Superstitions wove themselves into every aspect of life after dark. To hear an owl's cry was more than a simple sound. It was an omen of death. To meet a black dog on a deserted road was to encounter a demon in disguise. Travelers carried charms, crosses, or herbs to ward off spirits. Even the direction of the wind or the brightness of the moon could be interpreted as signs. The medieval world had little tolerance for randomness. Events were part of patterns, and those patterns often seemed hostile when the sun was gone. Darkness stripped away clarity, and in the absence of certainty, superstition filled the gaps. Folk tales reinforced these beliefs. Around hearths, families told stories of witches who flew to Sabbaths on stormy nights, of werewolves prowling forests, of spectral armies marching unseen across valleys. These tales were not mere entertainment. They were explanations of why night was dangerous. They gave shape to fears already felt and passed those fears from one generation to the next. A child who heard that spirits punish the disobedient after dark would carry that lesson into adulthood, internalizing caution as wisdom. The medieval night was not empty. It was crowded with the invisible company of legend. The church also contributed to these perceptions, though with a different emphasis. Sermons warned that night was the hour of sin, when lust, theft, and violence flourished. Darkness became synonymous with moral weakness, a symbol of the devil's influence. To resist temptation was not only to guard one's soul but also to keep literal lamps burning, both to light the body's path and to remind the spirit of vigilance. Priests encouraged confession of nocturnal sins, reinforcing the idea that what happened in darkness mattered doubly, for it was harder to resist evil when unseen by human eyes. The association of night with vice became deeply ingrained, shaping behavior long after the candles were out. Dreams, too, carried heightened weight in medieval thought. To sleep was to risk visitation from demons or to glimpse divine warnings. Nightmares were not dismissed as mere fancies of the mind. They were taken as serious signs, either of spiritual danger or of messages sent from the beyond. People prayed before bed, invoked saints, and sprinkled holy water on pillows, hoping to guard their unconscious hours. Sleep itself was a vulnerable state, and the fear of what one might see or be visited by in dreams added yet another layer of anxiety to the night. Astrology and the phases of the moon also influenced perceptions of darkness. Lunar cycles were believed to affect human behavior, crops, and health. A full moon was thought to provoke madness, a belief that still echoes in modern language. Certain nights were considered auspicious or cursed, depending on celestial alignments. The night sky, far less polluted by artificial light than today, was both beautiful and intimidating. Stars glittered, comets appeared, and meteors streaked across the heavens, each phenomenon interpreted as a sign. To live in a medieval village was to see the cosmos more vividly than most people do today, and with that clarity came both awe and dread. Animals added to the tapestry of nocturnal fear. Dogs barked at unseen presences, cats slipped silently through shadows, horses shied from invisible threats. To medieval minds, these behaviors confirmed what they already believed, that animals sensed spirits and forces humans could not. A howling dog at midnight was more than a nuisance. It was evidence that the veil between worlds had thinned. Even livestock were watched for unusual movements, their restlessness at night taken as proof that something sinister was near. The behavior of animals became another layer of the night's ominous code, read by communities desperate for signs. Witchcraft accusations often grew out of these night fears. A neighbor glimpsed walking in the dark might be suspected of casting spells. A woman whose herbs glowed faintly in lamplight could be accused of dealing with demons. Night offered both cover for those practicing folk remedies and danger for those who might be misinterpreted. Darkness made identities uncertain, and uncertainty bred suspicion. Communities could turn quickly against those who seemed too comfortable with the night, labeling them as agents of its terrors. The fear was not only of spirits but of human allies who walked beside them. The psychological toll of these beliefs was significant. To lie awake, listening to the groaning timbers of one's house, to hear distant footsteps in the street, to see a flicker of light where none should be, each of these experiences could feel like confirmation of stories already known. Fear was not an occasional emotion, but a nightly presence, woven into the fabric of life. Children were trained to respect it, adults learned to live with it, and the elderly carried it to their graves. The medieval night was a kind of shared hallucination, shaped by cultural expectations as much as by actual threats. Yet these beliefs also provided a sense of control. If one carried the right charm, said the right prayer, or followed the right ritual, one could hope to ward off danger. Superstition gave rules to the chaos, offering explanations where none seemed available. The psychological need for order was as strong then as it is now, and in the face of unrelenting darkness, order was imposed through story, ritual, and belief. Fear, in this sense, became both a burden and a coping mechanism, simultaneously oppressive and reassuring. To know that something caused the fear was to believe it could also be resisted. The cultural legacy of these night fears endured long after medieval times. Many superstitions, from the unlucky nature of black cats to the haunting cry of owls, persist today. Our modern horror stories, with their haunted houses and prowling monsters, echo medieval legends. Even the association of night with crime and sin continues, reflected in laws, customs, and language. The medieval night cast a long shadow, shaping how later societies imagined darkness. What we inherit from that time is not only history but also habit, a lingering suspicion that what happens at night is different, more dangerous, and less trustworthy than what happens by day. The medieval night was therefore as much an inner experience as an external reality. It was a theater of the mind, a stage on which culture, religion, and imagination acted out their parts. To walk through it was to walk through centuries of belief layered upon every sound and shadow. Each creak of a floorboard, each rustle in the hedges, each flicker of moonlight through shutters, these were not random occurrences but signs loaded with meaning. And so, the terror of medieval nights was not only about what might physically happen, but also about what people believed was happening all around them. Which leads us to ask, when the darkness outside was thick with superstition, how much of the fear was truly of the night itself, and how much was of the mind that interpreted it? When the medieval day gave way to night, the world did not simply grow dimmer. It changed in character, reshaping every routine, every thought, and every human encounter. Darkness was not a neutral condition, but a force that demanded respect, caution, and adaptation. From the moment the last fires were banked and doors barred, the community shifted into a different rhythm, one shaped by limitation, vulnerability, and unease. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a cycle where night held an authority nearly equal to that of the sun. The physical conditions of night alone created extraordinary hardship. With little artificial lighting beyond fire, tallow lamps, or a scattering of candles, Most spaces were swathed in gloom. Walking through a street without a torch was to surrender to blackness so complete that one could lose direction a few steps from home. Buildings loomed as indistinct silhouettes, bridges disappeared into shadow, and forest paths became dangerous labyrinths. The absence of light was more than inconvenience. It was a profound barrier to safety, travel, and productivity. To modern eyes accustomed to city glow and electric lamps, the medieval night would feel like entering a void. Yet the dangers were not only natural. Human threats multiplied in the dark. Thieves, bandits, and opportunists exploited the cover of night to act unseen. A city watch might patrol, but their reach was limited, and corruption often made them unreliable. Rural roads were worse, where travelers risked ambush by men who disappeared easily into fields and forests. Inside villages, suspicion of strangers was heightened at night. To knock at a door after sundown was to invite mistrust. Hospitality, a valued custom by day, often evaporated after dusk, replaced by fear that the visitor might carry ill intentions. Darkness collapsed the fragile sense of community security that daylight sustained. The natural world, too, seemed to close in with menace. Wolves howled beyond village walls, their calls echoing across valleys. Bears still roamed in parts of Europe, and wild boars prowled forests. Even harmless creatures, owls, bats, or nocturnal insects were perceived as omens. To hear certain animals was to anticipate death or disaster. The medieval imagination interpreted these sounds as warnings from a world that was never fully understood. In this sense, nature itself conspired with darkness, reinforcing the idea that the night belonged to forces hostile to human survival. And yet, people adapted. Communities lit torches and placed them at town gates. Night watchmen carried lanterns and rang bells to mark their presence. Families gathered tightly in one room, sharing heat and safety. Religious rituals offered spiritual protection. Prayers were said before bed. Charms hung above doors, and holy symbols were kept close at hand. To prepare for night was an act of survival, a recognition that vulnerability demanded not only physical precautions but also spiritual defenses. The rituals themselves became habits, comforting in their repetition, proof that people could push back against fear, however slightly. The psychological burden of darkness, however, was never fully lifted. Night carried symbolic weight that seeped into every cultural and religious context. It was the domain of sin, temptation, and demonic influence. It was the time when witches convened, when restless spirits wandered, when werewolves prowled. The Church used this symbolism to teach moral lessons, equating light with salvation and darkness with damnation. In sermons, hymns, and prayers, the imagery of night reinforced an entire worldview where fear of physical darkness intertwined with fear of spiritual corruption. A peasant crouched behind shuttered windows was not only hiding from thieves, but from the devil himself, imagined as roaming freely once the sun had set. Even sleep was fraught with anxiety. Beds were shared, sometimes by entire families, sometimes with strangers in inns. The vulnerability of unconsciousness meant that prayers were offered for safe passage through the hours of darkness. Dreams were not dismissed as meaningless. They were omens, warnings, or temptations. Nightmares were signs of spiritual battles being fought within. Thus, even rest could become another arena of fear, another reminder that the night was never truly safe. Despite all these hardships, the medieval night was not entirely without its softer dimensions. For some, the darkness brought intimacy, storytelling, and a slower pace of life. Families shared tales by firelight, songs were sung, and bonds were strengthened. The limitations of night forced a kind of togetherness that daylight's busyness did not always allow. In monasteries, night was also a time of devotion, with monks rising at prescribed hours to chant prayers in candlelit choirs. These moments gave the night a sacred quality, transforming terror into discipline and darkness into contemplation. Yet even here, the underlying sense of fragility remained. Looking back, what is striking is how profoundly the medieval night shaped human behavior and imagination. It taught people to respect boundaries, to recognize vulnerability, to prepare and protect. It created stories that became folklore, superstitions that survive to this day, and patterns of thought that still color how we perceive darkness. Even with our electric lights and 24-hour societies, echoes of medieval fear remain. We still associate night with crime, nightmares, and secrecy. We still tell ghost stories best after sunset. And we still measure courage by what we can face when the lights are gone. The medieval night reminds us that human beings are not only shaped by what we can control, but also by what we cannot. Darkness humbled communities, forced cooperation, and demanded rituals. It imposed its rhythm on life and impressed its symbols upon culture. To understand those nights is to understand how societies endure fear, how they explain the unexplained, and how they adapt to limitations that cannot be overcome. As we imagine those centuries of nights, black streets, creaking shutters, whispered prayers, we must ask ourselves, were medieval people truly more afraid of the dark than we are, or did they simply understand more clearly what darkness means?